Hello again, I'm Ernie Kiger, and welcome once again to Van Meter's Life in the DMV. Halloween has come and gone, and so is the time change. The World Series is over, and the leaves are turning, so it's the time of year baseball fans refer to as hot stove season, where players often change teams via free agency or trade. Here in Washington, many of us are still in celebration mode from last year's World Series win, and who can blame us, but many more may not be aware that Washington has a long baseball history that rivals nearly every other city in America. And today we're going to learn a little bit about that. Please welcome to the program a very special guest and longtime DC Baltimore broadcaster, Phil Wood. Phil,
Hi,
things are brilliant, and it's a real privilege, pleasure to have you here. Phil, if you're up for it, I'd like to throw out a name, a game, a team, and have you give us a little bit of education on that. Is that all right? Okay.
Shoot. Yeah.
I'm going to roll back the hands of time to the year 1944, 1945, and the Washington Senators had a very most memorable starting pitching rotation. Why was it memorable, Phil?
Well, it's memorable because as opposed to the 21st century, when knuckleballers are few and far between, the rotation for the Senators in 44 and 45 contained 4 knuckleball pitchers: Roger Wolf, Dutch Leonard, Mickey Hefner, and Johnny Nigling. Now, there was a 5th starting pitcher on that club, Chick Peretti, but he just threw conventional pitches. But the other 4 threw knuckleballs, and the catcher for that team was Rick Farrell. And Rick Farrell is a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame, and a lot of people seem to think that having to put up with catching 4 knuckleballers is what got him in. And in fact, Farrell used to talk about those seasons that he would wake up in the middle of the night and baseballs would be coming at him. These guys all threw different kinds of knuckleballs. Some of the kind of standard, 55 to 60 mile an hour type, and some of the little harder thrown, the 75 to 80 mile an hour type. But he had to be ready for everything. And obviously, when you're catching 4 knuckleballers and you're not quite sure where the ball's going to end up, somebody said that's why they have catchers. Otherwise, the ball keeps rolling back to the backstop.
I can't even think of one knuckleballer in the game today. There might be one. You might know.
Well, the thing is, there's no shortage of guys who experiment with it in the bullpen. But if you throw a knuckleball and it doesn't, and it starts to rotate, that's the whole idea of throwing a knuckler, is that you don't want the ball to rotate. You want to let whatever wind currents are there take the ball wherever it might take it. But it's a difficult pitch to throw, and it's an even more difficult pitch to catch. It's one of those things that if you look at the more successful knuckleball pitchers of the past few years, and I'll give you a name. R.A. Dickey threw a great knuckleball and won a Cy Young Award throwing a knuckleball. But his knuckleball was unusual because he threw it hard. He could get it up there 79, 80 miles an hour with no rotation on it, and it would move like crazy. Whereas if you look at the standard, Hoyt Wilhelm type of knuckleball, Tim Wakefield, when you'd see the speed register on the scoreboard, it would be 58, 59 miles an hour. And of course, Wilhelm, when he pitched for the Orioles, the manager Paul Richards came up with a special glove that if we could show people that glove now, they would laugh, because it looks like something it's like a clown with oversized shoes. The glove, you can basically pick apples and put the apples in the glove. It worked. It was finally outlawed by baseball, but it got the job done. The issue was finding the ball once it was in the glove.
I'm playing Little League baseball and high school baseball. I never faced a knuckleball pitcher. It's too darn difficult.
Of course.
I did have the chance to play catch with former Senators pitcher Dick Bosman once. And without telling me, he was throwing me knuckleballs. I never want to play with that guy again. I mean...
Well, Dick could also throw a great spitter as well, but he knew the time and place for everything. It's funny, I had a friend in college, a kid from Pittsburgh, who could throw just a hellacious knuckleball, And sadly, he was horribly out of shape. He could throw it, but he couldn't field it. But it's again trying to play catch with someone who is throwing a baseball that is acting like if you remember the old Mexican jumping beans you used to buy. That's kind of the way that a really good knuckleball will actually move on its way to home plate, and it's hard to catch. It's certainly difficult.
Well, in that same time span, 44, 45, there was another pitcher named Burke Shepard who played for our Senators. You knew him.
Yeah, I knew Burt well. In fact, well, first of all, just to backtrack a little bit. The 44 Senators finished 25 games out of first place. The 45 team was in the pennant race until the very last part of the season. And because they had finished so low in the standings in 1944, Clark Griffith agreed that he would let the Redskins have Griffith Stadium a week early. And so the Senators finished their season in 1945 on the 23rd of September. And the week, everybody else had another week to play. And of course, at that point in time, a lot of players were coming back from the war, and a gentleman named Hank Greenberg came back to the Tigers, and Greenberg, that last week of the season, was on fire. And the Tigers caught the Senators and beat them by a game and a half, basically on the last day of the season. So, but Burke Shepard had been in the war. Burke Shepard had actually was a bombardier, and his plane was hit. And he lost a leg, and he was a prisoner of war. And while he was a prisoner of war, he made his own prosthetic leg out of wood and leather. And then he was involved in a prisoner swap, and he made it back to the States. And when he got back, someone said, well, what do you want to do? He says, well, I was a ball player before the war. He played minor league baseball. He says, I plan to resume my career. And they said, well, on one leg? And he said, yeah, I've got an artificial leg. I can still run. So anyway, Clark Griffith, I'm sure he thought it was a great move from purely a PR standpoint. But Griffith signed Shepard to a contract, and they let him work out with the club. And so many of the players on that team in 45, I got to know years later. And they said Burt was just a great guy, and that had a great sense of humor about only having one leg. What Burt said, he didn't. He says he had to have a great sense of humor, because he said here he was in a pennant race with a major league club. And so he said sometimes after a game, he would go in the shower and he would leave his prosthetic leg in his locker, and he'd come back out and somebody would have taken it. And one of the other pitchers on that team was a young man named Walt Masterson, who later was the baseball coach at George Mason University. And he said one time he took it home with him, so Burt had to do without it for a day. But again, the Senators were in a pennant race, and I think they were reluctant to actually use Burt in a game. They used him in an exhibition game that they played against the Dodgers. And Leo DeRocher was the manager of the Dodgers, and DeRocher told his players, "Don't you dare bunt on this guy, because we'll look like bums if we try that." So he pitched in the exhibition game, but he was on the active roster, and so there was a game a little bit later against the Red Sox, and the starting pitcher was a young man named Joe Cleary. And as it would work out, that was Joe Cleary's one and only major league appearance. Joe Cleary came in the game, and he faced 8 hitters. 5 of them got hits, 3 of them walked. He gave up 7 earned runs, got 1 man out. So he finished his major league career with an earned run average of 189 runs per 9 innings. But they brought Burt in the game against Boston, and he went 5 1/3 innings. And he allowed 1 run. He was extremely effective. And he obviously batted and didn't have any issues running the bases.
Starts his wind up again. Here it comes. He swings, hits the fly going into right field. Campbell's going over to way over there near the line. It's up there. It hits that against that wall. Bounce out in there. Gilbert pulls up at second base with a 2-base hit. That ball was right.
The voice that everyone is hearing right now is one of the premier names in Washington sports history. He didn't become a Hall of Famer because of his broadcasting abilities. We know him as the Big Train.
Well, Walter Johnson is really a remarkable guy. I mean, he broke in with the Senators in 1907, finished up in 1927. The story I like to tell is that on the day he passed away in 1946, he had 414 wins in the major leagues. Today, he has 417 wins. So he's the only guy in the Hall of Fame to win 3 games after he was dead. So that's pitching, that's really pitching, Ernie. Well, again, the reason why is they went back and looked at all of his games some years later, and they realized that they had miscounted the number of victories he had. But it's clear that he is the premier right-handed pitcher of all time, the winningest pitcher of the 20th century. And for a number of years, he was also the losingest pitcher of the 20th century, but that mantle ended up going to a young man named Nolan Ryan, who was always compared to Johnson. But Walter was with a second division club for most of his career. Obviously, they were pretty good in the 20s. And they got, by the time he had retired and was managing the Senators, they were better. In fact, he managed them 29, 30, 31, and 32, and they were a first division club. They were a contender. And then he left after the 32 season to manage the Cleveland Indians, and Joe Cronin came in 33 and won the pennant. But Johnson was a side-arming fireballer who didn't like moving guys off the plate because he was always afraid he'd kill somebody. He was soft-spoken, and of course, in this political season, he actually ran for Congress in 1940. The guy running for president was Wendell Willkie, and Johnson lost. He was running as a Republican in a heavy Democratic area, but and he essentially didn't really campaign. He didn't like making speeches, so he just kind of would make some appearances here and there, sign some autographs. It's interesting, you mentioned that he broadcast the Senators games in 1939 in the booth along with a guy named Harry McTighe. And what's particularly interesting about the recording that exists of one game against Cleveland in September of 39 is that season, Walter was also the public address announcer at Griffith Stadium. So if you listen to the broadcast, you'll hear him say, coming up next for the Indians is third baseman Ken Keltner. And then he gets off mic and it basically leans over to the PA mic and goes, now batting for the Indians, number 4, Ken Keltner. I mean, it's Clark Griffith, the owner, was going to get his money's worth out of an announcer. That's for sure. And Walter's style was just, basically Walter's everyday voice. I mean, he didn't put on any airs about it, and he certainly knew what he was talking about. But it's interesting on the tape, you hear Harry McTighe do a commercial for Walter's upcoming appearance at the 4th Street Market, where he says, come on down and Walter will sign your box of Wheaties. And I thought, where are those boxes of Wheaties now?
Phil, I have a date for you, September 30th, 1971.
Senators trail 5-1, but they have time to catch the Yankees. There's a long drive to left field. This one is going. It is gone. Frank Howard has just hit home run number 26, and again he gets a standing ovation. And the cheers for Hondo, who waved his batting helmet to the fans. I just wish the owners of the American League could see this. The ones who voted 10-2 to move this club out of Washington.
Well, I was 20 years old. I was in college at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee, where I am right now. And it was the last game for the Washington Senators. And it was one of those things where I never thought, much like 4 years ago, we didn't think that a certain blonde-haired gentleman would become president, and he did. And you couldn't imagine that the American League would okay the relocation of a team from Washington, but they did. The vote they held the vote on September 20th, which was my sister's birthday, and then September 30th was the last game scheduled against the Yankees at home. I would have been there if I hadn't been 750 miles away, but I watched the news that night, and of course, back in those days, everything was all the news cameras were using film, so they could only shoot a little bit of film early in the game, and then take it back and develop it and put it on the air. So there is no actual video of the end of that game. Well, there's a little bit of the end of the game, but in terms of seeing the entire game, there's audio. There's Ron Mancini's broadcast of the last game, which is, even now is kind of heartbreaking to hear. But the idea that they would play that game, and really the winning or losing that game was of really little consequence, though I will point out they were winning 7-5 when the fans came on the field, and the game was forfeited to the Yankees 9-0. But it's the idea that 33 more seasons would pass by before Major League Baseball got back to town. That just didn't seem feasible. Oh, they'll put a team back here. I still have the Washington Star newspaper from the following day, and the headline is, Earl Foreman says he'll buy Padres and move them here. And of course, Earl Foreman had owned the Washington Caps of the ABA, and he was one of the prime movers and shakers in the old, major indoor soccer league. And but he had every intention, apparently, of buying the Padres, and that didn't work out. And it's just kind of interesting that the Padres, who came into the National League in 1969, along with the Expos, that they would try to get the Padres and fail, but they got the Expos 33 years later. But and obviously now that we can look back and see the impact that the Nationals have had on the sports market in DC, and of course the joy quotient of going to a World Series and winning it in 2019, which the idea that would happen in our lifetime, Ernie, I didn't see that. And I really thought their best chance to do anything would have been 2012, and that kind of blew up in their face.
The Homestead Grays.
The Homestead Grays, the true dynasty team of Washington. The Grays, who originated in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Homestead, Pennsylvania, but they started scheduling games in Washington and eventually became the Washington Homestead Grays. But they were, I think they won 7 straight championships in the Negro League. And it's interesting. There are people who will say, well, how legitimate is that? Because no two teams in that league played the same number of games. And you had, they talk about Josh Gibson hit 1,000 home runs, but he only hit, 250 against Negro League competition. He hit a lot of home runs off, the Red Lion Boys Club, all these exhibition games he used to play. Well, again, that's really not his fault. The point is he was a great player. I did a couple of panel discussions back in the 70s and 80s with Buck Leonard, who was on that team. And Buck talked about, and this came up recently because someone had written something in the Post about, we're kind of taking George Preston Marshall's name off some things because he was racially intolerant, I guess is the kind way of saying it, and that they should do the same thing about Clark Griffith. And my point was, well, Clark Griffith was not Calvin. Calvin Griffith, who was his nephew and adopted son, was the guy who kept the Senators white. And Clark in 1939 actually had Buck Leonard and Josh Gibson come by his office and talked about the prospects of them playing Major League Baseball. And Buck said that, the old fox leans across his desk and says, well, do you boys think you could hit Major League pitching? And Buck said, well, some of them we could, some of them we probably couldn't. We're like anybody else.
Good answer.
And so he said, but it went on and on. He says that it was clear that Griffith was interested, but he didn't want to be the first. His point was, well, as soon as somebody else signs some of your players, he says, now you understand, once we start signing your players, your league will fold. And they both said, yeah, well, that's not our problem. We want to play against the best competition. So, but sadly, by the time that other teams started to sign players, Brooklyn, of course, being first and foremost with Jackie Robinson in 47. But Clark Griffith had kind of turned over day-to-day operations to Calvin. Clark was getting up in years. But one thing that he did try to do on the suggestion of Mickey Vernon, his first baseman, who had served in the military with a young man named Larry Doby, he actually made an attempt to acquire Doby from the Indians. Well, Veck wouldn't trade him. And at that point in time, the Senators wouldn't have had much to offer in trade other than Mickey Vernon. So that didn't happen. But the contact was made, and it was it wasn't until 1954 that Washington had a black player, and it was Carlos Paula, who was Cuban. They didn't actually have an African American player until 1957. When Joe Black, who had made his debut with the Dodgers back in 52 and was Rookie of the Year with Brooklyn, by the time he got to Washington, he couldn't get you out, unfortunately. His best days were behind him, but he did appear in some games for the Senators in 1957.
Now, we just had a batting champion in Juan Soto, and you mentioned Mickey Vernon. My mom, her favorite player in the 1950s. You've been doing a lot of talking. Let's close it out with a little on Mickey Vernon.
Well, first of all, I got to know Mickey really, really well, and Mickey was my father's favorite player on the Senators. And in 1980, I was going up to Philadelphia to essentially sit with Ron Weber at a Caps game against the Flyers at the Spectrum. And Mickey Vernon lived in Wallingford, PA, which is not far outside of Philadelphia. And so I'd never met him, but I thought, well, everyone says he's such a nice guy. So called him up, and he said, please stop by. Okay. So his house was easy to find. He lived on East Rose Valley Lane in Wallingford. And again, I had not met him before, but after 20 minutes, it was like he was my uncle. I mean, he was the kindest man. His wife, Lib, was terrific too. We had sandwiches for lunch, and then we sat around and talked baseball. And he said, "Have you ever held a silver bat?" And I went, "No." "Would you like to?" And I went, "Yeah." So he had this velvet bag that the 1953 silver bat from winning the American League batting title was in. And so he takes it out of the bag and he hands it to me, and I'm holding it. And he says, "Well, go ahead and swing it." So I did. And here's the thing. He's taking pictures of me. It should have been the other way around.
What would a silver bat go for today? Oh, yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Thousands. But anyway, and I said, "Well, did you get one of these when you won the title in 46? He said, "No, they weren't doing this in 46. He said, "In 46, we got this scroll that was kind of in a frame that just basically, it had the Hillrich and Bradsby logo on it, and it had my name." And he says, "So yeah, the silver bat is much, much neater than what we got in 46. But anyway, over the years, I went back and visited Mickey and Lib a number of other times. I got to know their daughter, Gay Ann, who now lives, she's retired in Arizona now, but she was in radio in the Boston market for years and was an award-winning journalist. And anyway, once I got married and had kids, my kids got to know Mickey too. And we stopped by their house once. We had gone up to Sesame Place to take the kids and went over to the Vernons, and we had dinner with the Vernons. We went out to eat. And, Mickey Vernon put my daughter in the high chair at the restaurant. I mean, and again, they were just so, it was like family, really. I mean, and then, as the years went by, and of course he scouted for the Yankees for years, and he'd come through Baltimore, and we'd meet for lunch. And then when he finally retired, but there's so many things stick out. But when he turned 70 years old in 1988, I sent him a birthday card, and he called me up and he says, "Thanks for the card." He says, let me tell you something. He said, the morning I woke up and I had turned 70, and I walked into the bathroom and I looked in the mirror, and he said, how did this happen? 2 weeks ago, I was 50. He said, "Now I'm telling you this because this is going to happen to you too." And let me tell you, he was right. He was right. In 2008, he was 90 years old, and he and Lib had moved into an assisted living facility in suburban Philly. And I called him up and I said, "How would you feel about me coming up with a camera crew from Mid-Atlantic Sports Network, and we'll do an interview?" He said, "Great, I'd love to see you." So he went up, and I had a producer and a camera guy with me, and they set up in this dining hall at this facility he was at. Again, he was he looked great, and I took a couple of his old bats with me, and he's swinging his bats, and they're shooting video of that. And we sat and we talked, and we probably talked for about an hour and a half, and we edited it down. Well, sadly, Ernie, a week later, he had a stroke. And a couple of days after that, he passed away. And his daughter had called me. Gay called me up, and she said, "Well, I just wanted to let you know that Daddy had a stroke, but he said he wanted me to call you and let you know." And she said, I have to tell you, things don't look good at this point. And then when he passed, she called me back, and she says, "Well, when we have our service, we would like you to speak at the service." And it's probably the highest amount of flattery I think I ever had in my life. So I went up in Pennsylvania, and it was at a chapel, basically. And I've got one of Mickey's jerseys from the 1955 season with Washington. And so I passed it around the room while I'm speaking. I said, "This is so Mickey's here. And so whatever little DNA he left in this shirt, you can all let it rub off on you." And so, yeah, that was, again, of all the people I've ever known in baseball, he will always be number one on my list because he was just the kindest, warmest person I ever knew. Again, as I said, it was like we were blood.
It seems to me, I've known you for many, many years as well. And
Yes.
We both grew up in Northern Virginia. We both fell in love with a team that lost a whole lot more than it won, but that wasn't important. It was our team, and we heard the stories of the past from our fathers and our grandfathers about Mickey and about Josh Gibson, and my grandfather even told me about Walter. And today's fans, it just seems to me that there's a 33-year gap. And my real selfish intention here with a show like this is to try to help fill in some of that 33-year gap for those who did not experience this part of Washington baseball history. And I got to say, nobody can do that like you can, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's really just one little word to the audience. It doesn't pay well, but it's memories that last a lifetime. And again, the people I've met just through Washington baseball, so many of the old players and broadcasters. I knew Bob Wolf really well, and Dan Daniels, and of course Ron Manchin was a friend of both of ours, and Warner Wolf. Warner, who the very first day I worked in broadcasting, I worked with Warner back in '73, and it's all these people, all these broadcasters. Chuck Thompson, he did the games 57 through 60. I mean, they all had an impact on me, and it's just what a life I've been allowed to have. I mean, I am the living Forrest Gump, just in terms of the people I've been able to interact with and know personally. It's what a great way to make.
Well, maybe next time we'll talk about rock and roll. What do you think? Okay,
I'm ready. Hey, I mean, let me grab this and. I just happen to have a Stratocaster handy and
take us out.
So, yeah, it's not plugged in, but anyway, no, that's it's one of those things that I find a real correlation between baseball and rock and roll, and I think again they're both major parts of American popular culture, and I've yet to meet a baseball player who doesn't wish he could play guitar.
Or a lot of us wish we could play guitar. I've taken the uke now, but it's only 4 strings. I thought it'd be easier. Not really.
It's not too late, Ernie. It's not too late.
All right, Phil, thank you so very much for being with us. This was a very, very special show, and enjoy your hot stove winter, and hopefully we'll catch up in maybe in Palm Beach. All right.
I think we're probably more likely to catch up in Alexandria.